You people always try to sneak into places you don't belong. The sentence hung in the air like poison. It wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The smug certainty behind the words was enough to cut through the hum of engines, the clinking of glasses, the soft jazz meant to soothe high-paying travelers in first class. And then came the sound. Smack. A sharp, echoing slap tore across the cabin. Everything stopped. Dr. Elias Monroe didn't flinch. His head tilted slightly to the right where the blow had landed, a flush of red already blooming on his cheek. But he didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rise from his seat. He just looked at her. Lauren Briggs, the chief flight attendant, stood over him, hand still halfway in the air, frozen like a statue that had just come to realize it wasn't invincible. Her eyes darted, trying to gauge the reactions around her. No one spoke, but everyone had seen. Row 2A. "This is my seat," Elias said, voice low and calm. "You just made a decision this entire airline is going to regret." Lauren's lips twitched, torn between fear and false authority. "Sir, I've warned you several times." "Without ever checking my boarding pass," he interrupted, lifting his phone with steady hands. She didn't respond. A few passengers across the aisle exchanged uneasy glances. Some reached for their phones. Others looked away, pretending they hadn't just witnessed what they did, pretending they hadn't heard what she said before the slap. Moments earlier, everything had been calm, polished, first class as it was meant to appear. Champagne flutes, imported almonds, plush seats the color of ivory. Lauren had been making her rounds, greeting familiar faces, pouring top-shelf liquor with a smile, until she saw Elias Monroe. Black, mid-40s, clean, understated navy blazer. No designer watch, no name she recognized, no aura of deference, just calm confidence. And that had bothered her. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin, sir?" she had asked, lips tight behind a fake smile. Elias had calmly shown his boarding pass, digital, crisp. "First class, 2A, Elias Monroe." She hadn't even glanced at it. "We reserve this area for priority passengers only. This seat may have been assigned in error." He had simply repeated, "This is my assigned seat." Lauren's voice had risen, performing for the cabin. "Then I'll have to ask you to show me your elite membership or move to economy." Now, standing over him after the slap, she realized what she'd done. But it was too late. Elias tapped his phone screen once, thousands of miles away, in a secure FAA-linked server farm near Washington, D.C. A line of code activated. "Silent alert, human dignity breach. Airline RS-118. Strato 12 override condition met." Back in the cabin, no one saw the signal, but they were about to feel its consequence. Across the aisle, a young man stopped recording and looked down, ashamed. A woman in pearls muttered to her seatmate, "I thought we were better than this." Lauren, trying to regain ground, straightened her skirt and hissed, "You'll be reported for insubordination, sir." Elias didn't answer. He looked out the window at the dusky sky, gold fading into indigo. The horizon stretched wide and silent. A storm was already building, but not the kind made of clouds. It had started the moment she struck him, and this time, the sky would strike back. The seatbelt sign above them remained lit, but tension in the cabin no longer had anything to do with turbulence. Dr. Elias Monroe sat still, not out of fear, but with a sense of practiced control. Years ago, a younger version of himself would have responded with words, with fury, maybe even tears. But not now. Now, he just breathed. Through the window beside him, dusk deepened across the Atlantic. The last strands of sunlight curved behind the engine blade like a curtain drawing shut. He glanced down at his phone. One notification blinked on the secure app he'd created years ago. Strato 12. Override condition activated. He locked the screen and slid the phone back into his pocket. Across the aisle, the hum of quiet murmurs resumed. But no one looked directly at him now. Some passengers glanced sideways, others stole awkward peeks. Everyone had seen it. The slap, the tone, the assumptions. And none of them had done anything. Except one. In seat 2B, a man in his early 60s with a tired face and Wall Street posture turned to him. "I just want to say, I saw everything," he said softly. "I didn't speak up. I should have." Elias gave a faint nod. He appreciated the words, but he didn't need them. "I understand," he said simply. But deep inside, Elias didn't need apologies. He needed accountability. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting himself float into memory. The first time someone told him he didn't belong, he was 8. He'd wandered into the VIP lounge at the airport with his father, an aircraft mechanic who'd worked on private jets for over 2 decades. A young white hostess had walked straight up to his father and asked him to leave. "This space is for elite clients," she'd said, emphasizing elite like it was a weapon. His father had smiled, nodded, and gently placed a hand on young Elias's shoulder. "Let's go, son," he'd said. "We don't need their champagne." But Elias had never forgotten. By 14, he was reading FAA protocol manuals for fun. By 22, he was building prototype simulation models for aircraft route optimization. His graduate thesis on systemic bias in air travel design had gone unpublished because an Ivy League reviewer labeled it too activist in tone. By 33, he had invented Strato 12, the system that revolutionized navigation efficiency across global airspace. And by 40, he had transferred full operational rights of Strato 12 to the US federal government, with one condition encrypted deep within the license agreement. Any aircraft using the system would immediately enter priority override if a breach of passenger dignity was recorded and verified. It had taken him 3 years to get that clause in. Lawyers fought it, executives laughed it off. But one high-ranking FAA administrator, a woman who once saw her immigrant husband wrongfully removed from a plane, had said yes. And now that clause, ignored for years, was active. Right now. Somewhere near DC, a soft chime sounded at the FAA Air Navigation Command Center. A junior analyst squinted at her screen. "What's this?" she said, tapping the override alert that had just popped up. Her supervisor glanced over, his brows furrowed. "It's a passenger dignity breach trigger, tied to the Monroe Protocol." He stood slowly, a sinking feeling forming in his gut. Who activated this? Strato 12 system on board RS-118, in airspace over the North Atlantic, altitude 35,000 feet. The supervisor turned pale. "Get Director Holloway on the line. Now!" Back on the plane, Elias sipped water from the plastic cup the assistant flight attendant had brought him with trembling hands. She didn't say anything. Her eyes looked down, but her hands were careful, respectful. That was enough for now. Lauren Briggs hadn't returned yet. She was in the galley, speaking in hushed tones with another crew member, checking a printed passenger manifest like her life depended on it. Because maybe it did. The moment she looked down and saw the name Dr. Elias Monroe, the oxygen left her lungs. She looked up again, eyes scanning the cabin with dawning horror. She hadn't slapped just another first-class passenger. She had slapped the man who helped build the sky she flew through. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen systems update alert, we are preparing for a precautionary descent. We will be making an unscheduled landing at Reykjavik International Airport. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." A wave of whispers swept through the cabin. Elias didn't move. He knew. This wasn't about mechanical failure. This was a system deciding, on its own, that the sky no longer made room for the kind of behavior Lauren Briggs had just displayed. And for once, it wasn't the victim who had to prove he belonged. The captain's announcement had barely ended when the cabin began to shift. Seatbacks straightened. Glasses were quietly removed from tray tables. The orchestra of elite comfort gave way to murmurs of concern and glances toward the cockpit. Lauren Briggs emerged from the galley with a face several shades paler than it had been an hour ago. Her pristine posture was faltering, her tight bun slightly looser, the authority in her step noticeably softer. She clutched the passenger manifest like a lifeline. Her eyes scanned down the list until they landed on 2A. Monroe, Elias. Priority override clearance. Level Alpha. She had never seen it before. Most flight attendants hadn't. It was a designation reserved for passengers under a sealed FAA category, those with influence not just over airlines, but over airspace. The kind of clearance you didn't question. Her stomach twisted. She turned toward the cockpit and disappeared behind the reinforced door. 2 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, for safety protocol verification, we are requesting that all flight attendants secure the cabin immediately and report to crew positions. A subtle shift rippled through the cabin. Businessmen who usually barked orders now looked uncertain. Retired diplomats and tech investors stared at each other like they were suddenly aware of how fragile even first class could be. At 35,000 feet, no title, money, or miles status could override an automated override from the FAA. Lauren returned to the aisle but avoided eye contact with Elias. Her voice cracked slightly as she instructed passengers to remain seated and calm. Elias watched quietly. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was just resolved. Because this wasn't about vengeance. It was about alignment. For too long, flight crews had felt emboldened to bend rules against the vulnerable, confident that silence and privilege would shield them. Today, that shield had cracked. Across the cabin, a young woman in her 20s looked up from her phone. Her feed was already buzzing. A grainy video of the slap had hit social media. Someone from 3D had uploaded it under the title, "Flight attendant slaps first-class passenger for looking out of place." #Strato alert. Within minutes, it had racked up 42,000 views. Next to her, a middle-aged man whispered to his wife, "He's the guy who built that Strato system, right?" She nodded slowly, remembering the headlines. "He is the system." Back in the rear galley, Lauren was shaking. She picked up the in-flight phone, trying to reach corporate. No signal. The override had disabled all non-essential communications. She was on her own. When she stepped into the forward galley to retrieve water for another passenger, she stopped in her tracks. Elias was standing, not rising aggressively, just standing calmly, his eyes level with hers. She froze. He didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small security badge, and held it in front of her. FAA Strato Design Director. Clearance Alpha, active. Then he returned to his seat. That simple gesture deflated whatever defiance she had left. She turned away and walked stiffly back toward the rear of the plane. Across the cabin, for the first time that flight, a murmur of something different passed through the air. Respect. Not because Elias demanded it, but because he had never needed to. He just had to remind the sky who wrote its code. The descent announcement hung in the air like a warning, not just to the passengers, but to everyone who had chosen silence up until now. Flight RS-118 was beginning its emergency landing procedure, heading toward Reykjavik, Iceland. It wasn't for mechanical failure, no visible threat, no turbulence. But everyone on board could feel something had broken, and it wasn't in the plane's systems. It was in the illusion of safety that privilege often provides. Dr. Elias Monroe sat quietly, hands folded, gaze fixed out the window. The Atlantic had turned steel gray below them. Iceland's rocky coast would soon appear, jagged and cold. But to Elias, it might as well have been the edge of a truth long buried. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man finally gathered the courage to speak. "Dr. Monroe," he said carefully, his voice low but respectful. "May I ask, is this really happening because of what she did?" Elias turned to him. "No," he said. "It's happening because of what no one did." The man nodded slowly. The weight of that truth settled like fog in the air. Lauren Briggs, standing stiffly at the front of the cabin, looked like someone unraveling from the inside. Her shoulders were rigid, her hands clenched behind her back, but her expression betrayed her panic. She had tried to recover her composure, reapplied lipstick, straightened her collar, but her eyes gave it away, darting, desperate, measuring the distance between herself and the door. No one spoke to her, and she didn't dare approach Elias again. The first-class cabin was no longer hers to command. Back in the FAA Emergency Response Center in D.C., Director Holloway's voice sliced through the tension like a surgeon. "Is the override still active?" "Yes, ma'am. Altitude now 17,200 feet, full descent. Reykjavik Tower is clearing runway 3. She narrowed her eyes. "And the verification?" "3 independent reports now corroborate the incident," the analyst said. 2 passengers and 1 crew assistant. The protocol was met within limits, fully justified. Director Holloway nodded once. "Then let the landing proceed. Notify Icelandic Aviation Authority we'll need federal presence on arrival. Discreet but firm." Back on board, a quiet urgency had crept into the cabin. Phones were no longer hidden. At least half a dozen passengers were scrolling through news feeds. "He's all over Twitter," one woman whispered. "Dr. Elias Monroe. He built the Strato 12 system." Another voice. "He gave it to the FAA with an ethics override trigger. I didn't even know that was possible." The murmur swelled. "He wrote the code. He wrote the sky." In row 3, a teenager with a silver laptop muttered, "The whole airline industry's gonna freak out over this." And then, without prompt, a ripple of instinct moved through the cabin. Passengers who had kept their heads down now shifted their gaze to Elias, not out of curiosity anymore, but with something closer to respect or guilt. Some looked at their own hands, remembering the moment they saw the slap but chose not to move. A woman near the front pulled her cashmere scarf tighter around her shoulders and whispered, "We all saw it, and we let it happen." Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth has its own volume when silence breaks. The plane touched down with a soft jolt. The cabin remained quiet. No applause, no chatty relief. Just a dense, aware silence. When the wheels hit the tarmac, a quiet bing signaled the start of the taxi. Within moments, 3 Icelandic aviation officials boarded through the front jetway. Suits, badges, calm authority. One of them spoke directly to Lauren. "Ms. Briggs?" She flinched. "We've been informed of a passenger rights violation under the FAA Strato 12 protocol. We need you to step aside." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know who he was." The officer didn't blink. "That's not the problem. The problem is you thought it mattered." Passengers around them shifted. Lauren looked around, hoping, praying for someone to speak for her. No one did. Even the passengers she had once catered to with practiced smiles and flattery avoided her gaze. Her hands trembled as she followed the officers down the aisle. Someone filmed it. Elias did not. He remained in his seat, still, calm, as the system he'd helped build did exactly what it was designed to do. Not to destroy people, but to remind them that decency wasn't optional. After the door closed behind Lauren, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll remain on the ground for a brief compliance review. We appreciate your cooperation." A beat passed. Then, for the first time since takeoff, someone clapped. It started in row 4, then row 6, then the whole cabin. Elias looked up, not surprised, but quietly moved. He nodded once, politely, to no one in particular. To everyone. Outside the plane, media vans were already forming. But Elias wasn't thinking about headlines. He thought of his father, walking him out of the VIP lounge when he was 8. Of the professor who had laughed at his idealistic design clauses. Of the thousands of passengers who'd been whispered at, glared at, subtly humiliated, but never slapped. Not publicly. Not like this. And he thought of how silence had protected every person who had ever wielded a uniform like a shield. Not anymore. Not on his system. Inside the cabin, the assistant flight attendant, Grace, her name tag read, approached him timidly. "Dr. Monroe," she said, I wanted to say I'm sorry. I saw it. I wanted to speak up. I froze, but I wrote the report. I verified the incident." Elias looked up at her. "That was the right thing to do." She nodded, eyes glossy. "Thank you for designing something that listens even when people don't." He offered her a quiet smile. Someone had to. In the airport terminal, a small group of airline officials waited to greet Elias with scripted apologies and carefully chosen words. But he didn't stop. He walked past them, coat over his arm, briefcase in hand. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall. He stepped into it, letting the cold air sting his cheeks, the same cheek that had taken the slap that started all of this. He didn't look back, because real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from the decision to never let it happen again, and that he had already written into the sky. The following morning, Reykjavik's air was sharp and clean, cutting through the layers of heat still lingering from the night before. Inside the sleek terminal, passengers from Flight RS-118 moved through the corridors slowly, as though they'd just stepped off a battlefield. None of them had slept much, not because of turbulence or poor service or time zone lag, but because something had shifted, something deeper than jet lag. At Gate 17A, Dr. Elias Monroe stood near a wide window, watching a different plane being prepared for boarding. He didn't have a ticket for that flight. He wasn't flying anywhere, not today. He had nowhere to rush. Right now, the airline was coming to him. In Washington, D.C., the FAA had already held an emergency press call. The words Monroe Protocol were trending on every major outlet. CNN, Reuters, The Guardian. Even international media picked it up. For the first time, a federal-level ethics override had shut down a commercial aircraft. No one had believed the clause would ever activate. Until Elias, until Lauren, until 2A. Now, it was global. The airport lounge was quieter than usual when the door opened and a team of executives stepped inside. The lead figure was Richard Denton, CEO of Apex Global Airways, the parent company behind the flight Elias had been on. Behind him were legal counsel, PR directors, and a grim-looking VP of customer experience. They looked more like a congressional hearing delegation than an airline leadership team. Elias didn't move. He stayed at the window. Denton cleared his throat. "Dr. Monroe," he began. "First, let me say how deeply sorry we are. For what you experienced, for what occurred on our flight. It was unacceptable. We take full—" Elias raised a hand gently, not rudely, just enough to stop the speech. "I'm not here for a performance," he said. "You don't need to convince me of anything." The room went still. Denton lowered his hands. "Then what would you have us do?" he asked, and for the first time, there was real sincerity in his voice. Elias turned to face them. "Not have you do," he said. "What you should have already done." He stepped away from the window, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Your crews operate under policies that allow bias to be enforced as procedure. Your reporting systems silence the honest and protect the polished. Your passengers, your real customers, know this. They've known it for years. You just haven't listened." The PR woman opened her mouth, but Elias continued. "I'm not here to bring a lawsuit. I'm not here to grandstand. But I will ensure that what happened in 2A becomes the last time a system failed to protect someone not because it couldn't, but because it refused to try." The VP of Customer Experience looked down. He knew exactly what Elias meant. "I suggest you start with accountability," Elias said. "Transparent, public, then reform. Not just sensitivity training. Cultural overhaul. Make sure your cabin staff know the difference between professionalism and prejudice." Denton nodded. "And Ms. Briggs?" Elias paused. "She doesn't matter. The culture that enabled her does." He moved to leave, but as he passed the group, he stopped beside the youngest executive, the only one who hadn't said a word. a junior ethics officer, barely 30. "Don't wait until someone builds another system to correct yours," Elias said quietly. "Be the reason it doesn't need correcting." The young woman nodded, eyes wide. Then Elias walked out. The next day, Apex Global issued a public statement, not a polished apology, a confession. They released cabin audio and security footage to investigators. They publicly confirmed the misuse of authority. They suspended the cabin service director, initiated a zero-tolerance policy across all brands, opened new ethics compliance teams across 5 continents, and most importantly, they announced the adoption of the Passenger Dignity Framework, built with Dr. Elias Monroe. Meanwhile, back in Bethesda, Elias's home office remained sparse. A desk, a window, a wall of patents framed in matte black, and one photo. His father in uniform, sleeves rolled up, engine grease across his collar, smiling. Elias stared at that photo for a long time that night. When his niece called from Atlanta, her voice shook. "Uncle Eli, they showed your story in my high school today. People were clapping. I've never seen something like that." Elias chuckled. "That's because we weren't taught to clap for dignity, just for success." She paused. "I'm proud of you," he smiled. "Then remember this. You don't need to invent a navigation system to change the world. Just refuse to accept the wrong direction." By the end of the week, over a dozen airlines had begun reviewing their internal ethics policies. A bipartisan group of senators introduced the Passenger Rights and Transparency Act, citing systemic failures in dignity protections. And the FAA updated its pilot training curriculum, now including a mandatory module, the Monroe Clause. But Elias didn't care about that. What he cared about was that the next time a black passenger stepped into first class, no one would think to question why they were there. Not because of a badge, but because of a standard. One written into the sky. 4 days after Flight RS-118 touched down in Iceland, the ripple had become a wave. Not just in aviation, not just in corporate boardrooms, but in kitchens, classrooms, and every corner of a country forced to reckon with a simple, uncomfortable truth. Silence protects power, and power unchecked writes its own rules. But not this time. Dr. Elias Monroe sat quietly on a different plane now, a private jet chartered not by luxury or ego, but necessity. He had been requested by the U.S. Department of Transportation to consult on emergency ethics compliance reforms. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same system that had once ignored him now asked for his guidance. He accepted, but only under one condition: that the conversation begin with listening. Across the nation, media coverage had shifted tone. What began as a viral incident, black CEO slapped in first class, plane grounded, had evolved. Editorials now dug deeper. News anchors asked tougher questions. Why was there ever doubt about whether a man like Elias belonged in first class? What systems allow perception to override policy? And perhaps the most unsettling, how many incidents like this go unrecorded? Aviation forums were flooded with stories. Passengers of color sharing moments of humiliation that once felt too small to name, but never too small to remember. Flight attendants recalling moments they witnessed cruelty, but didn't speak, because they feared for their jobs. Pilots admitting they'd seen patterns, but felt powerless to challenge HR protocols that protected prejudice under the guise of procedure. Now, they were speaking, because someone finally had. The meeting in D.C. was held in a room that didn't make speeches easy. Not a press stage, not a podium-lit auditorium, just a round table. No hierarchy. Elias liked it that way. Across from him sat the Secretary of Transportation, the FAA director, airline CEOs, labor union reps, pilot associations, and 2 representatives from national flight attendant unions. They had all seen the footage. They had all read the Monroe Protocol clause that most had once dismissed as symbolic. Now, no one used that word anymore. the secretary opened. "Dr. Monroe, thank you for coming. We want to start by saying," Elias held up a hand, "I'm not here to hear more apologies." He leaned forward, calm but unwavering. "I'm here to help you make sure none of you need to give one again." Silence. Not defensive. Reflective. He turned to the union reps. "You're the front line. What's your process when a crew member reports misconduct internally?" The older of the two sighed. "It varies. Sometimes it's reviewed, sometimes it's buried. Often, the crew member ends up labeled as a liability." Elias nodded slowly. "That's the problem. Your people shouldn't fear speaking truth, and passengers shouldn't need cameras to feel safe." He turned to the FAA director. "You regulate mechanical safety obsessively. Why not ethical safety?" The director looked down. "There hasn't been consensus on how to measure it." Elias replied, "Then build the measurement. Use the data you already collect. Incident logs, crew reports, passenger complaints. Create an ethics score." Denton, CEO of Apex Global, leaned in. "What if we start with your framework, the passenger dignity framework?" Elias looked at him. "No, start with your people. Let them build it. Let them own it. I'll advise, but they need to believe in it, not just comply with it." The room nodded. Not just performative change, foundational. Back at home, Elias's inbox had become a living archive of gratitude. Messages from school teachers, airport janitors, parents, veterans, entrepreneurs. One email stood out. From a mother in Milwaukee. "My son asked why someone would treat a man like you that way. I didn't know how to answer, but now I just say, because they didn't know who he was, and now they do. Thank you for making the world see." Elias read that one 3 times. He saved it. Later that week, Wright Skies Airlines, the 3rd largest domestic carrier, announced the adoption of the Monroe Clause across its entire fleet. Other carriers followed. WestJet, Horizon Air, even Polaris International. The clause became a new standard. If any verified breach of dignity occurred mid-flight, automated systems would trigger immediate incident flagging to FAA and carrier HQ. Automatic cabin lockdown of non-essential communications. Priority rerouting to nearest compliant landing site. Activation of in-flight ethics assessment protocol, no appeal, no discretion. The sky itself now demanded accountability. At a university in Chicago, the graduate ethics program introduced a case study on flight RS-1118. At a high school in Oakland, students voted to name their new STEM lab the Monroe Center. And in Bethesda, Elias received a handwritten note from a retired pilot. "You fixed something we all knew was broken. Not the plane, the culture. God bless you." At the next industry summit, Elias was asked to deliver a keynote. He declined. Instead, he asked that Grace Holloway, the assistant flight attendant who had quietly submitted the official incident report, be invited to speak. She did, with trembling hands, but a steady voice. I froze at first, but then I remembered what my mother told me growing up. You don't have to be loud to be brave. You just have to be honest. And thanks to Dr. Monroe, we now have a system that listens when we are. The room gave a standing ovation, not because it was scripted, because it was overdue. As Elias sat alone on the return flight from DC, a young flight attendant approached. She looked nervous, holding a tray with tea. "Dr. Monroe," she said, "I just wanted to say, I read your protocol. It's the first time I've ever seen something that made me feel like someone has our backs too." He smiled. "You're not alone up here anymore." She beamed. "Would you like anything else?" Elias looked out the window. "No, thank you. I've got everything I need." And with that, he leaned back, closed his eye, and let the quiet hum of the aircraft surround him. This time, it wasn't the sound of indifference. It was the sound of change finally taking flight. It was a week after the world learned the name Elias Monroe. But for the people who had been living in the quiet shadows of discrimination for years, It felt like a century of breath finally exhaled. Every airline had begun reviewing its internal codes. News segments no longer focused just on the slap or the video. Instead, they explored the implications. Who writes the rules in the sky, and who enforces them when no one's watching? In thousands of airports around the world, passengers looked at flight attendants differently, and flight attendants looked inward. This wasn't just a moment. It was becoming a movement. At the Right Skies Academy for Aviation Excellence, a training center outside Denver, a class of new flight attendant recruits sat in a classroom unusually silent for a Thursday morning. The screen at the front displayed a still image. Elias Monroe walking calmly down the cabin aisle, moments after showing his FAA badge. The caption read, "Integrity isn't about your position. It's about what you do when power tempts you." The instructor, a woman in her late 40s with 2 decades of flight experience, stood beside the screen. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were glassy. "I've served on over 9,000 flights," she began. "And I've made mistakes. We all have. But after Flight RS-118, I realized something. The rules we memorize won't matter if we forget the people we serve." She paused, scanning the room. That man didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't shame anyone. He just pressed a button and the system listened. That's how power should work. The recruits sat straighter. Outside the classroom, a newly installed poster displayed the updated crew values. 1. Dignity is not optional. 2. Silence is complicity. 3. The sky belongs to everyone. And beneath them, in smaller print, the Monroe Clause is in effect. Know it. Respect it. Back in Bethesda, Elias was back in his routine. Almost. Mornings with black coffee. Long walks past the Potomac. Afternoons reviewing academic papers for the aviation ethics journal he had co-founded years ago, but that no one read until last week. Now, subscriptions had quadrupled. One day, as he walked past the corner coffee shop, a barista inside spotted him. She stepped outside, apron still on. "Dr. Monroe?" she asked. "Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say thank you. I'm studying for my aviation maintenance license, and what you did? It made me believe there's room for people like me in this industry." Elias smiled. "There's not just room, there's need." She blinked. "Don't just take up space," he said. "Shape it." She nodded, a little stunned, then rushed back in to finish her shift. He kept walking. In Atlanta, a gathering was taking place. Not a press conference, not a protest. It was the first annual Passenger Dignity Summit. Hundreds attended, airline staff, policymakers, former passengers who had come forward since RS-118, and, seated quietly near the front row, Grace Holloway, the assistant flight attendant who had submitted the internal incident report. When Elias took the stage, he didn't speak like a hero. He spoke like a man who had lived long enough to know change doesn't last unless people hold the line. "The systems we build reflect the people we empower," he said. "And too often, we empower silence. I've watched good people choose safety over truth. I don't blame them. I understand them. But now, we've given them something better than safety. We've given them backup, real consequences, real mechanisms." He stepped back, letting Grace take the mic. She wasn't polished. Her hands shook. Her voice cracked, but she spoke. "I was afraid," she said. "I still am, sometimes. But fear isn't a reason to stay quiet anymore. Because now, silence doesn't protect power. It exposes it." The room stood, not in performance, in solidarity. That same night, Elias sat on his porch, watching the stars. His niece called. "They played a clip of your summit at my school," she said breathlessly. "Even the football coach clapped." He chuckled. "Uncle Eli," she added. "Yeah? Can you tell me something?" "Sure. Why didn't you just yell at her on the plane?" Elias paused, then smiled gently. "Because I wasn't trying to win an argument," he said. "I was trying to fix the altitude." Elsewhere, in executive offices across the country, Change was accelerating. Airline policies were rewritten. Unions demanded that the Monroe Clause be adopted industry-wide. College aviation programs began teaching not only engineering and hospitality, but empathy, bias recognition, and ethical intervention. In a conference room at Polaris Air, two executives debated whether to delay implementation of the FAA override triggers until next quarter. Their CEO interrupted. "No delay. If a system can protect people today, we use it today, budget or not." Meanwhile, Lauren Briggs, once the face of an untouchable position, had quietly resigned. No press, no interview. No, she now worked at a small hotel in New Hampshire. One afternoon, a guest entered. Black, mid-30s, quiet smile, business traveler. She hesitated. The man offered his ID, and for the first time, she didn't look past it. She just said, "Welcome, Mr. Hill. Let me know if there's anything you need." It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. 2 months after RS-118, a documentary crew asked Elias for an interview. He declined. Instead, he offered them something else. Access to dozens of crew members, passengers, and advocates who had spoken out after the incident. "Tell their stories," he said. "They're the ones who carried this forward." The film premiered 6 months later. It ended with a single quote. "When the sky remembers what we forget on the ground, that's when justice begins to land." E.M. At a global summit on aviation innovation, Elias appeared unannounced. He didn't speak. He just sat in the audience and watched. As a young woman, formerly a baggage handler, now head of ethics at Right Skies, walked to the podium and opened with, "Flight RS-118 changed my life, not because of what it broke, but because of what it built." Late that night, Elias opened an email from a flight attendant trainee. "I used to think quiet people couldn't lead, that maybe I'd never be able to speak up if something went wrong. But your story made me realize I don't have to be loud. I just have to be ready." He replied, "You are," then closed his laptop. Outside, a plane passed overhead. He looked up and smiled. The sky was learning. It was early spring when the invitation came, an embossed envelope, hand-delivered to Elias Monroe's home in Bethesda. On the front, the seal of the United Nations Civil Aviation Council. Inside, a formal request. "Dr. Monroe, we respectfully request your presence at the Global Aviation Equity Summit, where leaders from 120 nations will convene to establish a universal passenger bill of dignity." He stared at the words for a long time, not because he was surprised, but because he finally saw the arc bending, not toward attention, toward accountability. In Geneva, the air was clear, the sky bluer than it had been in weeks. Delegates arrived in waves. Policymakers, airline CEOs, transport ministers, and aviation activists from every corner of the globe. For once, they were here not to debate profit margins, but principle. And at the center of it all sat Elias Monroe. No badge, no entourage, just a quiet presence. And a name everyone now knew stood for something far beyond software. He sat between the director of Civil Air Navigation Services organization and a young air traffic controller from Nairobi. No hierarchy, just shared air. The summit began with a film, not the infamous video of the slap, but the ripple that followed. Clips of Grace Holloway's trembling voice, headlines about the Monroe Clause, students reciting new crew pledges in aviation schools, airlines unveiling the passenger dignity dashboards. By the end, many in the room were silent, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they finally understood it had never been about one man in seat 2A. It had always been about the seat next to him, and the one behind him, and the one across the aisle. Every seat, every person. When Elias took the podium, he didn't begin with a speech. He told a story about a boy who used to sit at the back of airplanes with his father, watching the VIP section through the curtain. About how that boy grew up designing the sky, and still got told he didn't belong in it. About a flight that didn't just land, it landed a truth the world had avoided for too long. And about a system that for the first time responded not with PR spin, but with structural change. He ended with this: "We've spent decades measuring everything in the air. Speed, fuel, altitude. It's time we measured who feels safe in it, not just who can afford it." The room rose, not in applause, in acknowledgement. That afternoon, the summit produced a global draft, the International Passenger Dignity Accord. The first clause mirrored Elias's own language. Dignity is not a luxury. It is a condition of transport. Back in the US, stories continued to unfold. An elderly black woman boarded a flight to Houston. When asked if she wanted assistance, she paused, smiled, and said, "No, thank you. I'm already flying on Monroe's Air." At a flight school in Sao Paulo, a student pilot wrote on her exam, "If I violate safety procedures, I lose airspace. If I violate dignity, I lose trust. Both ground the mission." And in a corporate boardroom in Chicago, a CEO played a clip of Elias's summit talk before announcing a new initiative. Every employee, from executive to janitor, would now undergo quarterly ethics impact training. "We don't just serve customers," she said. "We serve humanity." One morning, Elias received a package. Inside, a small silver pin, shaped like a compass. No note, just a single engraving, for those who refuse to lose direction. He placed it on his bookshelf, right next to a framed photo of his father, smiling beside a jet engine. Later that year, the FAA asked Elias to co-author their new standards framework. He declined, but sent back a single-page recommendation. No policy should exist without real-world testing. No protocol should ignore power imbalance. Every system must include a question: who isn't safe in this design, and why? They implemented it all, and named the new module the Monroe Assessment. On the anniversary of Flight RS-118, passengers from that flight gathered at a memorial event, voluntarily. No one mandated it. No cameras. Just people who once watched in silence and now came to say, "We remember." Grace was there. So was Daniel Green, the businessman who had stayed quiet too long. He handed Elias a letter. "You showed us how to respond without rage, how to lead without noise. I was once a silent bystander. Not anymore." Elias folded the letter and placed it in his jacket, then hugged him. In one corner of the room, a small plaque read, "Flight RS-1118, where the sky learned to listen." Months later, Elias returned to the airport where it all began. He didn't go to fly. He went to think, to sit in the same seat. 2A. It was empty, reserved. A staff member approached. "Sir, can I get you anything?" Elias looked up. "No," he said. "I just wanted to sit for a moment." She nodded. Before walking away, she added, "Thank you. My younger brother's a trainee now. He says he wants to be the reason people feel safe flying." Elias smiled. Then he's already better than I was. That night, as he walked back toward the terminal, a child stared at him in awe. Her mother bent down, whispering something in her ear. The girl looked up. "You're the man from the sky?" Elias crouched. "I'm just someone who helped the sky remember people matter." She grinned. "I want to do that too." He handed her a paper airplane from his coat pocket. "Start with this," he said. As she launched it into the air, laughing, he turned and walked away. The plane soared, and for the first time in a very long time, so did everyone watching. 6 months after the world watched a man stand still while justice moved around him, the seat next to him became more than a memory. It became a lesson. At airports around the world, that seat was recreated in aviation schools, corporate training centers, and even museum installations. 2A was left empty. But 2B, that seat was always filled by the next generation. In a bright classroom at the Monroe School of Aeronautical Ethics in Seattle, a school named not by vote but by petition from students themselves, a young girl named Naomi sat in seat 2B. She was 15, a scholarship student, the daughter of an Ethiopian immigrant who worked nights cleaning terminal floors. Naomi's assignment was to answer a simple question. What would you have done if you were sitting next to Elias Monroe? She didn't write an essay. She stood up and said it aloud. I would have said something, because silence makes prejudice feel welcome. The class clapped. Her instructor smiled. And in a small glass case in the hallway outside, a laminated copy of her words was slid next to a photo of the original seat 2B. Elsewhere, in a hangar-turned training center in Johannesburg, trainee cabin crews gathered around a simulator. Instead of emergency exit drills, they practiced ethics response scenarios. One instructor pointed to a screen, a simulated altercation, a bias-based seating challenge, a refusal to acknowledge a valid boarding pass. Now freeze, he said. What do you do? Not after the incident, during it. A young man in uniform raised his hand. I escalate to the protocol officer. Good, the instructor nodded. Now tell me why. Because if we only react after someone's harmed, we've already failed. The room nodded. These weren't rule followers. They were conscience keepers. In New York, an art installation debuted in Bryant Park titled Altitude 2A. It was simple, a recreation of a first-class row, placed out in the open, surrounded by interactive screens that allowed visitors to watch, listen, and reflect on moments of dignity lost and reclaimed. The plaque at the base read, "Some revolutions don't start with shouts, they start with stillness." Tourists took photos, students took notes. Former crew members stood silent in front of it, tears in their eyes. Elias Monroe never visited it. He didn't need to. He was already in the story. Back in Bethesda, life had returned to a quiet rhythm. But nothing was quite the same. Elias's street now carried his name unofficially. Neighbors called it Justice Row. One morning, a group of elementary school kids came by his porch holding a banner. Thanks for protecting our future skies. He invited them in for cookies. They asked him questions like he was a superhero. Do you fly jets? Can you stop bad people with your phone? Do airplanes listen to you like Siri? He laughed and answered every one. When they left, one girl turned and whispered, I want to sit next to you one day. He smiled. You won't need me there. You'll be the one people look to. At Right Skies HQ, a new mural was unveiled. It showed a sky full of hands, not raised in protest, but reaching forward, outstretched, open. At the bottom, a quote, We don't fly to escape the world. We fly to build a better one above it. The CEO, now in her second term after pledging full Monroe compliance, held a press briefing. This isn't the end of the movement. It's the start of the policy. Reporters asked if Elias would be appointed as ethics commissioner. She shook her head. He already did the job. The rest of us are just catching up. Grace Holloway now led training programs for aspiring flight crews. Her program was called The Moment You Choose. She opened every session with the same words. You don't get to choose your passengers, but you always get to choose your response. She wore no badge of honor, just a small pin, silver, shaped like a compass, a quiet nod to the man who never shouted. On the second anniversary of RS-118, Elias received an invitation from the U.S. President. They wanted to award him the Medal of Civil Courage. He accepted, but requested a joint award for grace. They both stood on stage, two unlikely figures bound not by title, but by timing. One had built the system, the other had activated it. That night, Elias gave a rare interview. The journalist asked, Dr. Monroe, what's the legacy of this movement? He answered slowly, I don't want a legacy. I want a standard. Legacies fade. Standards change behavior. Do you think the industry has truly changed? He smiled faintly. Ask the next person in seat 2B. At an airport lounge in Singapore, a young girl was being harassed by a fellow passenger. She was told she looked too common for business class. Before the flight crew could intervene, another woman stood. Former cabin crew, now retired. She held up her phone and said calmly, "I'm activating Monroe Clause monitoring. Step away." The aggressor backed off. The girl sat. The crew nodded. Another flight, another seat. But the sky? It remembered. On a clear May morning, Elias walked a familiar path near the Potomac. He passed cherry blossoms in full bloom, sunlight dancing on water. His phone buzzed. A photo. Naomi, the student from seat 2B, now in uniform. Her first flight complete. Caption, "Your sky is safe. We're watching now." He stared at the image for a long moment, then closed his phone and looked up. A plane passed overhead. He didn't need to know where it was going. He just knew it was flying with a different kind of code now. Not one made of software. One made of choice. And everywhere it flew, people knew. Dignity was in the air. 3 years had passed since the world paused to watch a man stay seated while justice stood up. The Monroe Clause was no longer just an aviation policy. It was a global model adopted in over 40 countries. From cruise liners to bullet trains, it became the new standard. If dignity is violated, the system will respond. And it started with a moment. A silence. A stare. A seat. 2A. In Washington, D.C., at the National Museum of American Progress, a new exhibit opened titled Flight Path to Justice. At the center of the exhibit, a replica of the cabin from Flight RS-118, constructed exactly to scale. Touchscreens lined the walls. Each allowed visitors to hear first-person stories from passengers, crew, and even silent bystanders who later stepped forward. Outside, school buses lined the curb. Teachers guided students through the entrance, handing them brochures that began with, "Before there was a policy, there was a person. Before there was a law, there was a line someone refused to cross." Inside the cabin, a small plaque beside seat 2A read, "Elias Monroe sat here." But this story is not about him. It's about what we allow when we forget who we are. In New York, a major airline had just completed its third quarterly audit of crew ethics under the Monroe framework. The results weren't perfect, but they were honest. And for the first time, passengers could view airline scores on an open platform. Transparency was no longer PR, it was practice. One former skeptic wrote in an op-ed, "I used to think this was overkill. Now I know it was overdue." Elias Monroe had stayed out of the spotlight. No book deals, no documentaries, no academic tours. Instead, he built something quieter, a foundation, Skyline Trust. Its mission, support young professionals in ethical systems design, focused on transport, public infrastructure, and AI governance. Naomi, the once scholarship teen who'd answered a question in seat 2B, was now one of its youngest directors. She led a global team mapping ethics protocols across public transit systems. At 18, when a journalist asked Elias why he trusted her with so much authority so young, he replied, "Because change favors those who didn't inherit broken habits." In Geneva, a panel convened by the United Nations reviewed a proposal to adopt Monroe Clause language in peacekeeping protocols. Not about transportation, about conduct. The Monroe Principle, one delegate explained, isn't about travel, it's about trust. In any structure where power meets the public. One night, Elias sat on a return flight to San Francisco. No media coverage, no escort, just a man flying home. Seat 2A. He noticed the name on the manifest in 2B. Layla Hassan, mid-30s, aerospace engineer, Middle Eastern descent. She arrived with a laptop and a quiet nod. When the drink cart passed, she offered him the first choice. Elias smiled. "Go ahead." She shook her head. "Respect moves first." He chuckled. You new to this airline? She nodded. First time in first class. Got bumped up by surprise. Was nervous. Then I saw your name. His eyebrow lifted. She continued, I design aeronautics systems. You're why I applied. They talked for the next hour. Not about policy, about possibility. When the plane leveled at cruising altitude, she turned to him. I used to think the sky belonged to the confident, she said. Now I know it belongs to the courageous. Elias responded, Courage isn't about raising your voice. It's about refusing to lower your standards. Back in Bethesda, Elias received an email from a passenger on a European rail line. A conductor denied me entry because of how I looked. I tapped the override button you helped build. Within minutes, headquarters responded. I wasn't just reseated, I was respected. That never used to happen. Thank you. At an international tech conference, Elias was named Global Ethicist of the Decade. He declined the trip. Instead, he sent a video message. Awards don't interest me, but if my work helps someone stand taller, or sit safely, or speak up without fear, then that's the only award that matters. Flight RS-1118 was no longer mentioned in media as an incident. It was called the shift. The moment when accountability moved faster than denial. When a passenger didn't scream, but the system did. And the echoes still hadn't stopped. Elias took one more flight that year to attend Naomi's first keynote speech at the World Transport Ethics Forum in Oslo. She stood before a crowd of regulators, technologists, and social scientists. Her voice clear, her posture proud. When I was 15, I answered a question. What would I have done if I were in seat 2B? Now I ask you all, what will you do if the next seat 2A needs you? The room erupted in applause, not for her alone, but for what she carried. Legacy, not inherited, chosen. On the way out of the auditorium, Elias walked past a display. It featured images from every global system now implementing Monroe-based ethics triggers, from aircraft to metros, schools to hospitals, even courtroom technology. Each caption carried a simple sentence. When systems listen, dignity travels further. He stopped at the last screen. A child boarding a plane in Nairobi, her hand clutching her mother's. Her seat marked 2A. She looked up at a flight attendant who bent down and said, Welcome aboard. We're here to protect your seat and your story. Elias smiled, then walked into the light. Above him, a jet streaked across the morning sky, not louder, just clearer. It was a clear fall afternoon in Boston when Elias Monroe received the letter. Not an email, not a printed memo, but a letter, typed, signed, delivered with intention. It came from the Federal Aviation Council. Subject: Invitation to chair the Global Passenger Dignity Commission. Founding session. At the bottom, under the printed signatures, someone had written by hand, This time, we want the system to begin with the right person. Elias didn't answer right away. He placed the letter on the edge of his desk, looked out the window, and breathed. That same morning, in a university lecture hall in Lagos, Nigeria, a student named Amara delivered her final thesis presentation. We often think policy shapes behavior, but behavior, when grounded in ethics, can reshape policy. The Monroe Clause didn't create integrity, it gave it a voice. Her professor, a veteran pilot turned educator, wiped his eyes before giving her an A. In Sao Paulo, a retired flight attendant stood before a class of incoming crew trainees. She placed a replica of seat 2A at the front of the room. This seat is not here for ceremony, she said. It's here as a mirror. When you serve people in this industry, ask yourself, what would 2A see in you? The impact was no longer episodic. It was embedded. In Chicago, Right Skies HQ unveiled its new AI-integrated ethics tracker, a dashboard that collected real-time data from flights across the world. Every report, every intervention, every override, it was live, transparent, public. Passengers could now view not just safety records, but dignity records. And for every flight, a message displayed. We monitor more than altitude. We monitor attitude. Elias sat on his porch that evening, sipping tea as leaves fell gently around him. He watched children play on the sidewalk, watched the wind stir their laughter. He remembered the silence of that first moment, the sting on his cheek, the hush that followed, and the signal he sent. Not a retaliation, a correction. The next morning, he replied to the council. He accepted, not to build something new, but to ensure that what already existed kept its promise. In Geneva, the founding session was held in a minimalist glass building overlooking Lake Leman. The commission gathered 22 representatives, each from a major transport region. Each brought data, but more importantly, each brought stories. A conductor in Prague who intervened during a verbal assault. A ferry captain in Manila who created a reporting channel for female passengers. A rideshare platform in Nairobi that used the Monroe algorithm to flag repeated low dignity ratings. Elias opened the session. He didn't begin with metrics. He asked a question. What's the first place someone feels dignity on a journey? A woman from South Korea answered, the gate. A man from Morocco said, the first glance. A young delegate from Bolivia said, the silence before the seatbelt clicks. Elias smiled. All of you are right, because dignity begins in air we don't measure. It begins in the space between us. By session's end, a global framework was agreed upon. Dignity Index Reporting, DIR. Mandatory public reporting of annual dignity incidents across all carriers. Dignity Intervention Training, DIT. Yearly recertification for all transport personnel. Passenger Dignity Charter, PDC. Posted on every vehicle in every terminal in every language. Automatic Public Acknowledgement, APA. Verified victims would receive immediate system-wide alerts to leadership, not just form letters. It was called The Air Between Us Accord Elias signed last. Not because he needed recognition, because he believed in being the bookend, the line that doesn't start things, but makes sure they end well. Months passed. The accord was ratified by 91 countries. In New Delhi, a woman stepped onto a train, paused as a man blocked her way. She tapped her device. A light on the platform pulsed blue. Within 3 minutes, security appeared. Not aggressive, just aware. The man backed away. The woman entered. No fuss, just flow. That's what change looked like now. In Toronto, a young boy in a wheelchair was denied boarding due to seat-type restrictions. His father activated the Monroe Clause override. The airline rerouted the plane, but more importantly, changed the seat design permanently. At home, Elias received no fanfare, just an email from Naomi. We're working on version 2.0. It includes intersectionality tracking and AI bias identification. Want a beta test? He replied, Proud doesn't cover it. Let's test it live. Later that year, Elias flew commercial again. No reserved seat. He sat in row 19. Next to him, a teen girl with braids and a patch-covered denim jacket. She glanced over, recognized him. Didn't speak, but nodded. Halfway through the flight, turbulence hit. She looked nervous. Elias smiled. You okay? She laughed softly. I'm not worried about falling. Just want to land in a place that respects me. He looked out the window. Me too, he said. But now, we're building that place on every runway. When they landed, she asked to take a photo. He agreed. As she posted it, her caption read, Sat next to Elias Monroe. Didn't just feel safe, felt seen. The next morning, in classrooms, crew rooms, and corridors across the globe, the following message flashed on every Monroe-aligned system. Today, someone boarded afraid of being overlooked. Make sure they land feeling valued. It was unsigned, but everyone knew. The air was still changing. Time had passed. Not in loud headlines or ceremonies, but in quiet shifts that changed the tone of everything. 3 months after Flight RS-118, Elias Monroe returned to Washington Dulles International Airport. It was his first time back since the day the nation had learned his name. There were no reporters waiting. No banners, no flashbulbs. Just a man in a gray wool coat, holding a soft leather carry-on and walking with the calm of someone who'd weathered storms the world couldn't see. The check-in agent glanced up from her screen. Her eyes widened just slightly. "Sir, are you?" Elias offered a small smile. "I just need my boarding pass. Seat 2A. She didn't press. She printed the pass. He nodded in thanks. They had been trained not to ask questions when the name was Monroe. In the first-class cabin, Seat 2A looked different now. Gone was the slick leather. In its place, dark navy fabric, same as what lined the chambers of Congress. Stitched into the armrest, in fine silver thread, were 10 simple words. Respect is not a feature. It's a default. Seat 2A protocol. Elias didn't sit right away. He stood beside the seat, taking it in. This was no longer a place of prestige. It was a promise. The flight crew entered. A young Indian-American woman, a Latino man, and a white woman in her 50s. All glanced toward Elias. No one said a word. And they didn't need to. Lauren Briggs no longer existed in this system. In her place was a new generation, trained under the FAA's Dignity Crew program, a protocol requiring every crew member to undergo ethics scoring, bias recognition, and accountability checks logged in real time through passenger feedback apps. Even the Strato 12 navigation system now included a new module Elias himself had helped design. The Human Bias Sensor, an algorithm measuring verbal and nonverbal cues across cabin interactions to detect patterns of exclusion or hostility. As the jet rolled toward the runway, the usual welcome message played. But this time, the face delivering it wasn't the pilot's. It was Grace Holloway, the once timid junior flight attendant from RS-118. Now, she stood tall as the FAA's Chief Passenger Ethics Officer, Eastern Division. She wore a Navy uniform with a gold Seat 2A emblem over her heart. Her voice was steady, no longer trembling. "Welcome aboard. Today, you're not just passengers. You're the keepers of the standard. We don't fly with silence anymore. We fly with accountability." Elias nodded gently. No smile, just a quiet acknowledgement. She'd become who she was always meant to be. At 38,000 feet, Elias opened his laptop. Not to work. To read a letter he had drafted months ago and never sent. To whoever sits in Seat 2A next. You don't need to be me. You don't need to invent anything. If someone questions whether you belong, don't argue. Just stay seated because you're not just holding a seat. You're opening the door for the one after you. He hit save, but didn't send it. He wasn't here for attention, just legacy. Later, a girl around 10 passed by with her mother. Black, bright-eyed, soft-spoken. She looked at Elias with recognition. "You're the man in the video, right?" Elias looked at her kindly. "I'm just a man who didn't move." She smiled, timid but wide. She didn't know it yet, but she had just inherited the sky. The plane touched down. There was no applause, just the hush of people who had witnessed something bigger than travel. A quiet respect had settled across the cabin, one that couldn't be bought, just earned. In the terminal, Naomi, Elias's assistant, was waiting. Young, sharp, sincere. She handed him a packet. Feedback data just came in. Passenger respect ratings are up 92%. 3 airlines just enrolled in the Monroe module. He nodded, taking it without ceremony. Naomi reached into her bag again, this time with a small stack of handwritten scholarship applications. "These came in from kids all over the country. They all want to sit in 2A someday. We thought, maybe you should choose the first one." Elias flipped through until he stopped at a note written in pencil, the edges smudged. "My dad cleans planes. He says people like us don't fly first class. I want to prove him wrong. Terry, age 11. Elias smiled, not out of pity, out of recognition. This kid had already boarded. That evening, in Chicago, a packed ballroom waited to honor Elias Monroe as the architect of the sky reform. But he didn't show. Instead, a simple message flashed on the screen. Respect was never a luxury. It just needed a seat. Back home, Naomi opened her laptop to write a blog post titled 1 Year After 2A. But she paused. Instead, she pulled up the footage, the moment Elias was slapped. She froze the frame, not at the slap, but at what came next. Elias's face. Calm, unmoving, not humiliated, just steady. She stared at that image, not to cry, but to remember that the biggest shifts in systems, in people, in history, often begin not with outrage, but with the decision not to move. The next passenger to change the sky might not even know they're boarding. Closing reflection. Let's talk. Elias Monroe never needed a stage. He just needed to know that the seat where he was once slapped now stood for something no one could take away: dignity. But what about you? Have you ever been looked down on because of how you looked, how you dressed, or how quietly you carried yourself? Have you ever stayed seated, literally or figuratively, when the world tried to tell you, you don't belong here? Or maybe you were once a bystander. You saw someone being humiliated, and for whatever reason, you stayed silent. If you've been there on either side, drop your story in the comments, not for likes, but because someone else might need to know they're not alone. And just maybe the next person to change the sky